Welcome everyone to our roundtable, Forest Life, Scientific Practice, Climate Politics. Thank you for being here or for watching the video, whichever the case may be. This is the second in a series of 3 workshops on climate change within the larger program of the Sawyer Seminar on Precision and Uncertainty in a World of Data, organized by the Departments of Anthropology and History of Medicine, as well as the Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, with support from the Mellon Foundation. To mention very briefly our third workshop, which is entitled For the Sake of the Climate, Meditations on Retooling the Economy, will be held on April 29th. And further details, as well as the videos of each of those 3 workshops, will be available on the Sawyer Seminar's website. We'll open the panel with brief presentations from each of the panelists to orient everyone to their work, and then we'll discuss a set of shared questions together for about an hour, reserving the last half hour for audience questions and for open reflection. So I'm so happy to introduce this really wonderful group of researchers who bring together rich backgrounds in forest science, climate and forest policy, anthropology, and social studies of science. Moving in order of time zone, we have first Dr. Julie Velásquez Runk, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Georgia. She has worked since the late 1990s with Hunan scholars and community members in Eastern Panama, first as an ecologist and then as an anthropologist. Her recent work focuses particularly on the dynamic, networked, and often unpredictable landscapes of biophysical characteristics, political decisions, and cultural beliefs that together form the situations which come to be understood as problems for conservation. She asks how to sustain forests and nurture human well-being in mosaic landscapes, how to strengthen cultural and environmental rights and sovereignty in the face of tremendous change, and how to make science more collaborative in theory and by incorporating multiple voices. Her book, Crafting Hunan Landscapes, Identity, Art, and Environmental Governments in Panama's Darien, was published in 2017 by University of Arizona Press, and the Spanish translation launched this past October with the press of the Colombian Institute of Anthropology and History. Her deep commitment to careful collaboration and co-creation is shown in many projects with Hunan partners, among the most recent of which is a trilingual children's book titled in English, The Adventures of Hunan Children and Many Birds. Next, moving west, we come to Javier Mateo Vega, who's currently in Costa Rica, but based in Rome, who works with the Alliance of Biodiversity and International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture as the Global Director of Partnerships and Communications, and is also completing a PhD in biology at McGill University. Prior to this, he was Director of the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative at Yale and the Smithsonian, Country Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Costa Rica, and Coordinator of the Environmental Science and Policy Program of the Organization for Tropical Studies in Costa Rica. Since the early 2010s, he has been heavily involved in participatory biomass mapping and monitoring, as well as scenario-based planning in Eastern Panama, designing field methods for tracking forest carbon with Embera and Hunan collaborators, and working to capture their visions for the future of their forests while closely following the many layered political tensions around proposed nature-based solutions, including REDD+, in this region of Panama. Our third panelist, Dr. Elsa Ordway, is Assistant Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCLA, where she directs the Forest Ecosystems and Global Change Lab. Her work takes as its focus terrestrial social ecological systems in the context of climate change and other intensifying environmental pressures, drawing together a combination of remote sensing, field observation, modeling, and socioeconomic analysis to understand emerging patterns in forests across scales, from specific ecosystems to global environmental change, with a particular focus on tropical forests. Her doctoral work combined high-resolution hyperspectral and LiDAR data, farm surveys, econometrics, and supply chain analyses to understand socioeconomic and ecological aspects of oil palm production in both Cameroon and Malaysia. And key areas of questions for her work include understanding functional ecology across scales, linking field observations and remote sensing measurements, understanding the role of forest ecosystems in global environmental change through historical data and modeling, and tracing patterns, pathways, and consequences of tropical deforestation. Then our fourth panelist, Dr. Sarah E. Vaughn, and the westmost of us, is a social-cultural anthropologist working at the intersection of environmental anthropology, critical social theory, and science and technology studies, and assistant professor of social-cultural anthropology at UC Berkeley. Her forthcoming book, Engineering Vulnerability in Pursuit of Climate Adaptation, which launches in April and has been awarded the Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award, examines climate adaptation against the backdrop of ongoing processes of settler colonialism and the global climate change initiatives that seek to intervene in the lives of the world's most vulnerable, through research in Guyana in the aftermath of the catastrophic flooding that ravaged the country's Atlantic coastal plain in 2005. The book analyzes co-production of race and vulnerability in the context of climate adaptation, tracing experts and ordinary citizens' disputes over resources and their attention to ethical practices of technoscience over time, exposing thereby the generative openings as well as gaps in racial thinking for theorizing climate action, environmental justice, and more broadly, future life on Earth. Her second book project will explore the relationship between meteorological sciences and private government partnerships in climate risk assessment in the Caribbean. Again, I'm so grateful for each of them for joining us. Now we will give each a chance to describe their own work, particularly as it relates to these questions of forest, science, and climate, going in reverse order to start with Dr. Vaughn.
Oh, I always forget, unmute myself. Thank you for the generous introduction, Perry. So I usually tell the story of how I got to questions about scientific practice and forestry through my fieldwork site, if only because working in coastal Guyana, often both the academic and popular imaginary of forests is the country's arguably what's called its Amazonian interior, which has been in the past decade or so, one of the canonical examples of REDD+ forestry projects across the world for thinking through and about low carbon, quote, low carbon development. However, when I did field work, long-term field work for this first book project in Guyana, which was 2009 to 10, more or less, and then extending into 2019, the other side of that story of the low carbon development strategy in Guyana was its coastal experience of managing sea defense. And part of that sea defense, not surprisingly, is its long stretch of mangrove forests. So I had this quite interesting parallel experience of having this, large scale idea and image of what constitutes forestry in REDD+ in terms of the country's geographical experience of low carbon development in the interior, but then relative to the actual lived experience of about 90% of the population living along the Guyanese coast, understanding forests really through the experience of mangroves as forms of sea defense. And so understanding that geographic divide, as well as this emerging kind of new economy around climate change that has to deal with simultaneously, not just climate mitigation through forestry initiatives of carbon markets in Guyana's context, as well as sustainable logging and conservation, but also how does one manage to invest in forms of climate adaptation for flood-related risks that take into account the conservation of forests. And so that's how I got to thinking about why forests matter in terms of the production of expertise around climate change, the adherence to and interest in local forms of knowledge, whether they be from engineers, fishermen, and other ordinary citizens, For me, forests are as much a question about how do we think about carbon emissions and ways to remanage our economies towards more sustainable futures, as much as it is this broader question of how one lives and inhabits the landscapes that are at risk, and how do we mobilize these forests to become kind of actual partners or agents in making those risks livable and manageable.
Thank you, Sarah. Next in reverse order, then we would have Elsa.
I actually do have a couple slides just to share as I talk through that. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and also just be sitting among these other panelists. I'm mostly looking forward just to the opportunity to engage with each of you and have this conversation. But let me just share a couple slides to give you all a bit more of background on where I'm coming from. Whoops, let me go back. So as Perry mentioned, my work is mostly focused in the tropics and primarily even further so in Central Africa and Southeast Asia, and then zooming in even more, Cameroon and Malaysia. And my work is, I'm showing 3 images here that kind of represent different dimensions of the work that I do. I'm sitting in an ecology department, but my work is quite interdisciplinary. I do a lot of work with remote sensing data. So what you're seeing here on the left is an actual image of LiDAR data showing an oil palm plantation in the foreground as that transitions into a forest reserve. And what you're looking at is canopy height. The colors actually correspond to actual points that are linked to that height. So they have more yellow, the taller the trees. And so that oil palm plantation is about 11 meters tall. And then as you move into that forest, there's quite a lot of variation in height. And so we look at that information to try to understand what underpins the interactions and impacts of these types of agricultural expansion impacts, for example, on forests that are, if not cleared, still left standing. And then also thinking about that heterogeneity that we see in the background. A key ecological question for me is really trying to bring in improved understanding of just how heterogeneous these ecosystems are. We talk about tropical forests as one biome, but there's so much variation within these ecosystems, not only from one continent to the next, but within continents, there's just huge amounts of variation that influences how they may or may not respond to changes, whether it's climate change or land use change. And in the middle, I'm showing a photograph of somebody I've worked closely with in Cameroon. This is an oil palm nursery, and a lot of my work has looked at oil palm expansion, and in a lot of ways, the nuance around that. There's a lot of publicity around the negativity of oil palm expansion because of the impact it's had on deforestation. Yet there's a much more complex story to it, I think. It's one of the highest yielding oil crops. It actually comes from Central West Africa. It's native palm to that region and actually holds a lot of cultural value and is considered kind of a staple crop for a lot of people there. And there are differences in dynamics of how it's produced from one family or producer to the next. So it is quite complicated, but really bringing that global story to a local space, I think, is really important to better understand drivers of change, but also thinking about sustainability and different solutions and what those might look like in local contexts. And then on the right, I'm showing a photograph actually that I borrowed from Congo Flux, which is the first and currently only flux tower in Central Africa. And this was put in Yangambi, DRC, in part by collaboration with a lot of folks at Yangambi Research Station in the DRC, which has been there for a long time and is now kind of getting a new life. And as well as with partners at the University of Ghent in Belgium. And so this is an image of a couple guys at the top of this flux tower getting it all set up. And what this does is allows us to actually measure and monitor fluxes. So carbon fluxes particularly of interest, also methane and water fluxes and energy fluxes. And this really helps us understand how these forests, what the role they're playing in climate change is. I'm actually going to skip through a couple of slides because I said more than I wanted to there, but I do want to get to a couple at the end. So a couple of things that my work is really focused on, again, is really thinking about what governs on the ecological side, regional and sub-regional heterogeneity in terrestrial ecosystems. But then thinking about how sensitivity or resilience to disturbance varies not only ecologically across these systems, but socially as well. So I do take this approach to thinking about social ecological systems. Some of my work focuses more on the social or more on the ecological, but a lot of it is with this goal of trying to more comprehensively understand the integratedness of these, interconnectedness of these social ecological systems and how the variation in that can influence, I think, differences in sensitivity or resilience to change that we're seeing. And a lot of the aims behind my research also is really to work towards capacity building and international collaboration, especially in a place like Central Africa right now. There's, I think, so much potential among researchers in those communities, whether it's researchers at institutions and of higher ed in a place like Cameroon, or people who live in forested areas who aren't engaged in higher ed. There's a lot of knowledge in these spaces that I think is just not currently being integrated into the way a lot of the public-facing conversation is had around kind of solutions to climate change. And a big part of my goals in the work that I do is also to really move us more towards equitable and ethical research. I think there's a long way to go still with that. And I think that's critical to really working towards any of these solutions as well. The last thing I want to kind of point out here, so I kind of already focused on Cameroon and Malaysia as being important. I also do a little bit of work in California, which I'm happy to talk about, but I'm not going to focus on now. But just to come back to Central Africa and Cameroon as I wrap up here, and to say that there's really an interesting body of research right now that's coming out that's pointing to Central Africa as being somewhat unique in response to climate change. So there's a lot of work that is showing that the Amazon forests are quite vulnerable and sensitive to climate change in the form of increasing tree mortality. We're seeing lots and lots of wildfires in those areas. We know there's been huge amounts of deforestation across a large part of the Amazon. In Southeast Asia, there's been a huge amount of conversion as well for crops like oil palm, as well as logging. And there's also many, many wildfires there. And what's interesting is that a couple of different papers I'm showing on the left here, this paper led by Amy Bennett, and then another one, Hubao et al. From 2021. Both of these are actually pointing to Central African tropical forests as kind of bucking this trend of increasing mortality. So a lot of field data is showing that as we see increases in tree mortality in parts of the Amazon or Southeast Asia, we're not seeing that in Central Africa. And this is across what we typically call intact forests. And so there's a big question as to why that is. And there's not a lot of understanding as to why that is, and therefore not a good understanding of how long that might last. And so I think there's a real need to better understand these systems. And there's also been this recent call for investing in science in the Congo Basin rainforests of Central Africa. And with that, I would say what we should really be thinking about is an investment in the people. I think I work closely with the Congo Basin Institute out of UCLA that's in partnership with the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. And I really do believe that that we can't move forward with understanding these ecosystems or thinking about sustainability without working really, really closely and engaging directly with researchers and people from communities who live in these places. So that's what we're really trying to work towards at the moment. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Elsa. I think next we come to Javier.
Great, thank you so much, Perry. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone that you're at. Really a pleasure to join you and the rest of the panelists on this conversation. I don't have any slides, so I'll just speak a cappella. But my broad interests lie in understanding the forces and trade-offs that drive and constrain forest conservation in complex, pluralistic, multifunctional landscapes. And I'm interested in contributing to the body of knowledge that informs how, like Elsa, socio-ecological systems, and like Sarah mentioned as well, can transition to low emissions and climate resilient development pathways and continue to generate a number of other key ecosystem services. Like our other panelist, Julie, I have had the enormous privilege of conducting research in parts of Eastern Panama, mostly in indigenous territories, both legally recognized and under claim that are under the stewardship of Embera, Wonan, and Kuna indigenous people. My research is rooted in two global trends, and the first, of course, is the pervasive problem of tropical deforestation and its implications on climate, biodiversity, and people. As we all know, despite the slowdown in the global rate of deforestation, we still are losing on average over the last 6 or 7 years about 9.3 million hectares of tropical forest across the world per year, which is an area equivalent roughly to the size of Portugal. This threatens 40 to 60% of terrestrial biodiversity, and of course could undermine global efforts to maintain average temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So that's one of the drivers. The second trend for my work is an increasing acknowledgement of indigenous peoples as key actors in forest-based climate change mitigation efforts and biodiversity conservation and ecological restoration, and not just as victims of this global phenomena as the literature and development discourse often portrays them. Along with local communities, indigenous peoples hold under customary tenure systems almost 25% of the global forest estate, a little bit more than a third of intact forests around the world. And when it comes to forest carbon stocks, estimates suggest that under indigenous stewardship, you'll find about 22% of global forest carbon stocks. And in the region that I work in Mesoamerica, that number ascends to about 50%. So much of the recent and growing interest in the role of indigenous peoples in forest conservation and management stems from many sources, but there's two that I'm particularly interested in, and these are two interrelated policy interventions or innovations that have garnered widespread attention in academia as well as among policymakers and practitioners over the past decade and a half. And the first one of this is REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is a climate change mitigation mechanism. It's now falls under the umbrella of nature-based solutions or the package of nature-based solutions. And I won't go into that because I assume most people on the call have heard of REDD+ as a financial mechanism to compensate on a performance basis countries or subnational jurisdictions for avoiding the loss or degradation of forests. One of the elements that's central to the architecture of REDD, of course, is the realization of co-benefits, including biodiversity conservation, sustainable livelihoods for local communities, poverty alleviation, and the opening or strengthening of green markets. And then the second policy intervention that I'm interested in looking at is, and that has drummed a lot of interest in the amount and the proportion of land and forest and carbon stocks that fall under indigenous stewardship, is this growing body of work surrounding the effects of land tenure reform and security on forest conservation and management. So there's evidence that suggests, although not universally, that devolving and formally recognizing land and forest rights to indigenous peoples and local communities may curb forest loss and degradation, and thus reduce carbon dioxide emissions and biodiversity loss. So within those two policy interventions, my most recent work explores the question of how indigenous people can participate fully and effectively in global policy processes such as REDD+ and forest tenure reform, which are processes that potentially can directly affect their forests, natural resources, culture, livelihoods for many generations. So I've had the privilege of working along with and for indigenous peoples on devising and testing forest biomass monitoring methods in the context of calls for the full and effective participation of local communities and indigenous peoples in REDD+. As Perry mentioned, I've also worked on participatory scenario-based planning using visioning and pathways development to elucidate potential forest future states based on indigenous people's desires and in line with their rights to self-determination. And as I mentioned before, my hope is that my work will continue to contribute to the growing body of knowledge around the conceptual framework of socio-ecological systems, which recognizes the strong interconnections and co-evolving dimensions of human and natural systems. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Javier. Next, our last presentation will be from Julie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Perry, and to Johns Hopkins for having us here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation with the panelists, so I appreciate you bringing us together. So I take a community approach to many of these same topics. I am trained both as an ecologist and an anthropologist, as well as a Latin Americanist. And I often say that I've been retaught by my Indigenous Vaughn colleagues. So I have been doing community-based research, community-based interdisciplinary research, I often say, as well as collaborative ethnography for now just over 30 years. And so I have those topics that Perry kind of introduced you all to, but I think part of this is that part of the work that I do is also just that it's run, who decides what we do is discussed among community members ourselves and myself, and we work through a series of agreements. So I have been working on a number of different topics as community priorities change over time. So these have included everything from forest ecology using remote sensing and vegetation plots to understanding as those vegetation plots how non-Indigenous management of forests is done and how it relates to this famous old growth area, purportedly old growth area of Eastern Panama where I work, to other methods like interviews, to walking methods, to story work, community history workshops, media analysis, legal analysis, participatory video, community archiving, etc. So throughout all the work that we do, I work with the Vaughn National Congress, who are the national authorities of Vaughn Indigenous peoples, as well as their foundation, the Foundation for the Development of Vaughn people. And I didn't begin my career in Panama, but it is the place where I've been longest working on these methods. So among our work are broadly anything related to people environment, but that is also included, for example, doing linguistic projects where we archived and rematriated over 60 years of traditional stories and transcribed and translated a subset with a team of Vaughn, as well as to, for example, work on illegal rosewood logging, something I'm still working on with communities, as well as more recent work on the relationships between birds and people, which is part of that digital, audio, and print children's book that Perry referred to at the beginning. And then I think another key aspect of the work that I do is trying to be very intentional about cultivating not just reciprocity, but redistribution. And so we have done things like taken linguistics classes together at the University of Arizona with our Vaughn team. We've done the repatriation again of stories to Panama and Colombia with the whole Vaughn team and national authorities. And also just trying to make sure that we produce materials that are not simply for scientific audiences, but also for Vaughn community, including, for example, an archive of materials for the last 60 years that I've been working on with retired professor Liz Lepofsky Kennedy, who worked with Vaughn in Colombia in the 60s. So that's some of what I do, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. I think it should be clear by now that there are really strong points of connection among each of the panelists, but also like very, very different backgrounds and very different approaches and very different relationships to knowledge production. So I'm really curious for the conversation that we will have. The first question that I'd like to raise as something to think through together is quite broadly around the relationship between climate change and the study of forests, and how climate imperatives change what it means to study forest and also what forest means. For instance, thinking about like in conservation policy, a shift from an emphasis on biodiversity that was taking shape, especially in the 1990s, to a current emphasis on carbon accounting. Could also think of that in terms of different forms of expertise and different categories of knowledge that are engaged and that come from different practices that we may try to bring together in understanding forests as ecological systems, but also as things that are deeply social. And on that question, also wondering how climate change shifts in each of your work, how you think about the relationship between knowledge production and the social world that it takes place in, or social worlds that it takes place across. What does climate change do to the relationship between knowledge production and social change?
Yes, I'll start. Thanks, Perry. That's a generative question, if only because I think, as I said in brief introduction, I often think about forests in the Guyanese context as a place that many locals don't really know about, in that unless you were born in interior regions within Guyana, one doesn't usually travel there unless they're miners or forestry officials. And so this idea that with climate change, mangroves in that local context became a site of contestation about the ways in which people could think about what climate risks are and why they matter, all of a sudden opened up this broader kind of social and historical awareness of how it is that expertise becomes a site of power and claims to livelihoods in the state. And so I guess I would, ground that broader insight in the fact that engineers historically in Guyana have been sort of the main actors in terms of how people understand flood risks. Yet, when taking seriously mangrove forests in the context of climate adaptation in Guyana, all of a sudden these engineers came into conversation with forestry officials, conservation ecologists, and had to try to figure out how to make these collaborative projects around forestry for sea defense imaginable. So that's not to say that, since Guyana's sort of coastal settlement in the late 1600s, that, Dutch to British engineers to Guyanese engineers never took seriously mangrove forests, they did. But it was in the sense that mangrove forests were separate from the hard infrastructure projects that as engineers they were facilitating and building along the coast. But by the time around 2009, when there were climate adaptation projects in the name of conserving mangroves, all of a sudden you had this whole kind of new network of knowledge practices around how to integrate hard engineering projects, sea defenses, groins, into understanding how those structures facilitated or changed the ways in which mangrove forests actually inhabit and grow along the coast. So that's just all to say that engineers themselves became, an interesting group of actors within this sort of growing node of climate expertise that sort of span the range of, as I said, ecological sciences, forestry, but also ordinary citizens who have used the coast for quite some time in terms of managing mangrove forests. So in that sense, beekeepers, as well as fishermen, and to a lesser extent, subsistence farmers. So for me, it was quite interesting to think about forests as not just these literal sort of ecologies, but also their own forms of technology, more or less, for thinking climate adaptation. So you have this interesting sort of play between how do you think of these built hard environments that engineers have to invest in, at the same time that one would have to think about how it is that forests themselves also become tools that engineers can turn to in order to imagine new ways of having more sustainable sea defense. And so people would often ask, whether in the local context or academically, even within anthropology, what would be the difference between, say, just thinking about sea defense itself and something that would constitute climate adaptation. And I think the Guyanese case offers a really interesting way to think about that turn and kind of ideas of anticipating not just say what a wave is doing, right, but also what forest ecology is doing. And so you get these sort of layered understandings of the ways in which you can think about how you would anticipate or manage sea defense beyond just what engineers can build, but also how those structures respond to the given ecologies there.
I wonder if something that I'm hearing there is then also that the possibility and the danger of climate change brings a different time orientation to that research, that suddenly there's this need to anticipate, to build scenarios, and that changes the kind of research that is done.
Yes, for sure. But I think importantly, as the other panelists have also noted, is that those ways of anticipation aren't just from the view of what the forests are doing, right? But how those forests interact with not just local livelihoods and human interactions with those forests. But you definitely see in the case with engineers literally thinking about built environments, right? How do built environments over time coexist with these forests? And how then can we think about different ways of modeling or scenario building that allow us to understand that interaction?
Wondering if I could jump in just with a thought on some of this. I think the time point you brought up, Perry, is an important thing. I don't know if, I think it's something that I'm starting to grapple with more and more, in terms of there's this urgency from the global community to come up with climate solutions because we have done so little and we've already moved so far into a danger zone. So in a lot of ways, there is really a need to think big quickly. But then when you do, I mean, as Sarah just really nicely put it, it's not just about these ecological systems, but it's about the interactions between those systems and the people who live there. And there's a lot of ways to think about that. And so we're not only thinking about different scales in terms of global scale solutions and local scale systems, but also the time scale in terms of the urgency for a need for solutions, and then the time it takes to understand those local scale systems to really develop or think about ways forward that do those local systems justice in some ways. And I think I also grapple with, I'm just going to kind of throw out a few different things that I struggle with right now. But something else that I think is a challenge for me is to see these kind of very almost black and white approaches to forest restoration and afforestation and forests as an answer. I think it's very clear that these are critically important ecosystems and conserving them is important. But I think, at least in my community in ecology, there have been some fairly controversial papers about, should we be reforesting areas that are currently savannas? And what are our baselines that we're trying to move towards? And you can think about metrics like biodiversity and carbon, but there's other aspects to those systems that are critical for understanding. And if we just focus on any one of those for benchmarks, what are we missing? And what areas are we thinking about? Because inevitably, I do think we need to start thinking about trade-offs. We have upwards of 10 billion people on this planet, and the amount of land needed for food, fuel, and fiber production is becoming increasingly scarce. But there's also pretty innovative ways we can think about using the land we already do have. So it gets complicated, but I know I'm throwing more questions out than answers, but I do think there's a lot to grapple with. And I think what I keep coming back to is we keep looking for these kind of global one-size-fits-all solutions, but I think it's going to be so critical to recognize that it's going to have to be so place-based and so much more nuanced. And so that to me is pretty obvious. But then this question of how do we reconcile the urgency with the need to carefully, really carefully move forward, which requires, I think, time to engage. So I'll pause there. I have a lot of other thoughts, but
Perhaps I could just build on what Elsa and Sarah were talking about. I guess local level customization of interventions are always going to be king in terms of addressing, in terms of grounding global policy processes in a way that's meaningful and culturally appropriate. But that also, you know, the question there, Elsa, that I also struggle with is how do you do that? You know, by keeping transaction costs low, by being able, and then also managing the time dimension of that, which is critical, right? You know, for those of us who've had the privilege of working with communities, it takes time. You know, I listened to Julie talking about spending 30 years of her career already in Eastern Panama. I'm only at half of that. And, you know, gaining any kind of credibility and taking the time to learn and doing things in a culture appropriate manner really take a long time. And I'm still learning a lot. I still make all kinds of mistakes, but I'm still learning a lot. This is one of the enormous challenges that we have. You know, Perry, I kind of wanted to touch base on a couple of the elements of your question, perhaps shifting slightly. And you know, the first one was this element of the shifting emphasis on biodiversity to forest biomass due to climate imperatives. And I just wanted to point out that, you know, arguably that has been the case, but it's also important to recognize that we can't, for example, monitor changing forest biomass without understanding biodiversity, specifically tree diversity, because we do rely on species-specific wood density data to, you know, run our allometric equations that will allow us to estimate forest carbon. And so other taxa might not be included, but biodiversity is certainly not absent from the equation. And in the climate-driven policy interventions such as REDD, as I mentioned before, the architecture is built in a way that it's supposed to generate other co-benefits such as biodiversity conservation. So at least in principle, mechanisms like REDD, whether you believe in it or not, this is in principle, it is supposed to fulfill two needs with one deed in terms of conserving carbon and biodiversity. The crux for REDD, and Elsa, I assume you have studied this extensively, is that the level of spatial congruence between carbon and biodiversity is quite variable. And you know, many assume you protect forests, you're protecting biodiversity. In many instances, that is the case. But these overlaps between, you know, high forest carbon densities and high species richness are not always perfect. There is no silver bullet. And so in the case of my own research in the neotropics, if your primary interest is carbon, you want to focus on Eastern Panama. You know, working with our indigenous colleagues in that region, we have found the highest per hectare forest carbon densities in all the neotropics compared to any other well-studied site in the neotropics. But if you're interested in biodiversity and using tree diversity as a proxy, then you will shift your focus towards the Amazon basin, places like Yasuni in Ecuador. So there's this challenge also of how do you direct your efforts, assuming that you have limited resources and energy to really shift the dial on these wicked problems. And that's a big challenge. And then Perry, in regards to new forms of expertise and knowledge practices in the forest biomass monitoring studies that we conducted accompanying Emberawonan and Kuna indigenous technicians, something that was really great was to see themselves bestowed with the title of Carboneros, which is a play on words of, you know, of their new acquired expertise in terms of estimating forest above ground biomass, so carbon stocks. And, you know, we collected data on tree height and diameter and identified tree species to estimate forest carbon stocks at various scales. And although that work was done in the context of possibly participating in the REDD mechanism, because many of these communities have been approached by the government and by others, the development of these new knowledges in terms of how to estimate forest carbon were not really driven by climate imperatives. And this has been stated by them. In this particular case, a previous study in Panama, wall-to-wall assessment of forest carbon, had determined that in the territories where many of these communities live, they had these very high forest carbon densities of about 130 megagrams per hectare, which is high for the neotropics. Some didn't really feel very comfortable, as that was expressed to us, with planes. And this was done through an airborne LiDAR study, Elsa, and they didn't feel very comfortable with planes flying over their territories, taking data without ever having stepped into those forests or having consulted with them. It generated a level of discomfort. And so they wanted to do their own study. And that's what motivated the study. It was demand driven. They came to us and said, could you help us in conducting this forest biomass monitoring study? And so that's when McGill and the Smithsonian came in. It was funded by the World Bank. The project was managed by an indigenous organization. They managed it financially and administratively, and they were the ones who brought us on board to help with the technical side, which was a really nice model that worked really well. But their interests were not based on climate imperatives. Their interests were in terms of the ground truthing, what they had learned about that airborne LiDAR estimate. And the other reason was because RED Plus has, as part of its requirements, land tenure. And so it conceivably could have been used as a mechanism to ensure claims to their territories, because many still don't have formalized or regularized land titles, and they're fighting very hard for that. And so if RED requires secure land tenure, then in principle they could use that as a mechanism to then go and claim that. So climate imperatives, they do care about climate change. And when you do speak to particularly some of the elders, they talk about how the conditions in the communities have changed, the temperature of the water, the temperature of the air, the availability, the access to wildlife or to building materials. But the imperative was really something else that wasn't even climate related. Yet this new acquired knowledge, these new acquired expertise, which are related to climate change, were driven by a whole different set of interests.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add that I think maybe you, Javier, earlier, who referred to RED Plus as a nature-based solution, but it is also part of rights-based conservation. And so I think that is part of this conversation as well. The other part, going back to kind of Perry's question about transitioning from kind of biodiversity to carbon, as we've seen happen, I often think of it with respect to the idea of kind of nutritionism in the food world. So I teach a food class, and we always talk about the change that happened, that rather than trying to malign any particular part of our foodways in the US, so rather than maligning or saying things are bad for you, like red meat or sugar, instead it began to be about these nutrients, which required nutritionists to explain them to you, right? It recategorized food in a way that was not intelligible to the average person. And I think of this transition to like carbon in forested landscapes or forest mosaics as also creating a type of expertise that's not immediately intelligible to the average person. So it's still creating, I think, we're perpetuating still colonial relationships in terms of expertise. And I think there are some exceptions to that. And we can hear about them and talk about them, but in general, that's how I see part of this change to climate and carbon, particularly for local communities.
I would add, though, too, that there is, even as we hear in this conversation, a kind of hierarchy in terms of what sites can be understood as beneficial for that transition. So coastal sites, if only because historically people aren't collecting data about what these mangrove forests are. I mean, you do have some parts of the world where there's a more intelligible and active community of conservationists and forest sites, coastal sites actually doing forestry work. But again, if you take places throughout the Caribbean, and in Guyana's case in particular, you haven't historically had those sites where you were collecting forestry information, right? So the idea of the coast being a place where we can think this transition is kind of a non-question. And in fact, that was a question that came up early on in a lot of the mangrove restoration projects in Guyana about whether or not we can think about these sites as carbon stocks. People said, well, why would we invest so much time and money in doing that sort of science as opposed to thinking sea defense, again, to this point about urgency. So, you know, which communities and what sites become valuable sites for thinking this transition to science is one that imposes a kind of hierarchy of people and places, and the quote importance of some forms of localized knowledge versus others, I would add.
If I could move into another question that I think especially connects to the very last thing that Sarah, you had mentioned in terms of like creating different hierarchies of sites of different localities due to like what is seen as conducive to certain pictures of becoming responsive to climate change in policy. And I was curious to think about in each of your work questions of like how we think about kinds of knowledge, different epistemologies and the points of connection between them, but also the ways that they're not necessarily like previously separate and then come to be connected, but that we're actually constructing, this is expert knowledge, this is local knowledge, this is indigenous knowledge, and then we are building connections across them. I would be curious to hear in each of your work how you think about the movement across different knowledge practices and also across different scales. When we have like very powerful techniques that are not necessarily always speaking to each other, if that question makes sense. For instance, in the case of like Javier, you described a situation where people actually sought out this training in response to these flights going over, not knowing what was going on with that, not liking that form of surveillance, but also there's so much that can be so powerfully learned in that way. How would we work towards how would we work through relations around different kinds and scales of knowledge production?
That's a really tough question, Perry. So using that same example, you had this wall-to-wall airborne forest biomass monitoring study conducted. It was ground truth by a group of indigenous technicians that we accompanied in the field. What we found was that there's a lot of variation in terms of forest carbon stocks across the territories that they inhabit, not just this large number that they had heard about from the remote sensing study. So we used different techniques of knowing and the area or scale of coverage between what we did, which was 31 hectare plots versus large swaths of the land being surveyed by an airplane. And even though our results were very similar when we took the average of our 30 plots, we found that the amount of carbon density was very similar between our study and that other one, but we found a lot of granularity, a lot of variation across that. And I think what was interesting was that the results gave some validation to their level of discomfort with the airplane flying over their territories, in the sense that they said to us, see, our results are different. You know, we have a much more granular level of understanding of our forest than any airplane could ever do. And it was, I think, very empowering to them. And then as they were being approached by the Ministry of Environment about participating in RED, they had a tool that was knowledge that was generated by themselves, even though it was using the techniques that we employ, but it really was very empowering in terms of allowing them to engage in informed decision making, and to begin to consider, if they were going to go down the pathway of RED+, whether it was as a project or a jurisdictional approach, that they knew their forest way better than anybody else. from that perspective of, you know, these constructs of forest carbon, the codification of so it was interesting to see that they were really interested in building their skill set in terms of being able to dialogue technically using our same technical language. And it was interesting to see that often their own world visions and understandings of the forest really weren't brought into the conversations. We never, you know, we sat in the meetings that they would have with the government of Panama. But it was interesting that often their own narratives about the meaning and value of forests weren't really brought to the fore. They really used this as a way to be able to speak just very much on the same language that they were hearing from their government counterparts. So interesting to see how techniques of knowing are transferable, and how these building of knowledges and skills can really be quite empowering. But it would have been very interesting to hear different world visions come into those conversations, but they felt like they needed to go and speak the same language as the other counterparts on the government side and on the technical side.
Just to kind of add to that, thanks for that. That's kind of example. I think it's really interesting to hear about, and something I also want to kind of come back to. Perry used the term expert knowledge. I think expert is something it's important to kind of move away from. I don't know that, or we just need to kind of be careful about how we couch what is expert and what form of expert. But I think thinking about these different knowledge systems is important, and increasingly kind of bringing them to the same level of agency, or recognizing the differences in agency or power associated with different levels of knowledge currently is going to be really important, in terms of how we try to find those meeting points across different knowledge systems. But what I think is really interesting, Javier, about what just you said, was trying to find commonalities in language where there could be these points of intersection. Something that I'm engaged with right now, which is really, really preliminary. I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do still, to kind of understand this more deeply, but working with Baka experts who, I just used expert, but Baka are indigenous to part of Cameroon and are traditionally a hunter-gatherer society, and have been ostracized from a lot of areas that they live in because of protected areas displacing them. And they continue to have an incredible knowledge of the ecosystems that they live near, though, and still spend a lot of time in. And one of the things we're thinking a lot about is how to think about forest types that are mappable from something like remote sensing, and how that intersects with their knowledge of forest types. Not that one is right, one is wrong, one is, recognizing that there's different levels of granularity to understanding. But what has become really interesting as an insight to me is that a lot of the characterizations of differences in forest type that I'm hearing from the Baka descriptions are things related to kind of where forest canopy gaps are, and heights of forest and understory, and how that relates to what animal species move through or use those spaces, and what plant species are there that are of particular medicinal use. And so kind of the interconnectedness with the plant species and the animal species, and how different kind of types of forest, and not just in space but in time also, connect to forest types on the landscape. And it is interesting because I think there's, I don't know, I'm really struck by, actually, I would like to kind of unpack Julie's comment a little bit too about carbon, and the potential for that to be a real colonial perspective on how we think about forests. And I think it's really important to dig into that. I wonder, I guess, if there's ways to think about it as something that, so for example, coming back to this example of Baka forest types, a lot of these canopy gaps or differences in height and understanding actually correspond in really interesting ways to carbon, but then there's obviously so much more to these differences. There's a lot more granularity, as just to come back to the term Javier used, to the ways that the Baka characterize these transitions in forests. And it encompasses what we think of as differences in terms of carbon, but so much more. And across kind of different dimensionalities as well. If we're thinking about biodiversity, if we're thinking about seasonality, if we're thinking about food sources, if we're thinking about all these other different links to forests. And so I kind of want to hear a little bit more from Julie about if she could explain further, because what I'm interpreting from Julie's previous comment is that maybe carbon is too, it's a language that's not accessible, but maybe I'm misinterpreting that. And I'd love to better interpret that, because to me, I think carbon is important on the one hand because it's so directly linked to climate change and understanding how these systems link to climate change. But if there is this inaccessibility, or for some other reason, some colonial attachment to how we're thinking about carbon in the context of forests, is it that it's we're distinguishing it from so many other components to forests? I think that's an important thing to kind of discuss here for a minute, if there's space for that.
Yeah, thanks for following up on that. Yeah, actually, I do want to comment that one of the reasons why I like carbon as a metric or as an objective study is it actually allows us to kind of pull away from the biodiversity emphasis on the global south and actually focus on the US and the global north and consumption and carbon, right? That's one of the things I really like. And in terms of where we are going, or the world is going, and thinking about climate change and science, I think it allows us to put a lot of emphasis in this part that's really been neglected. And we've heard a lot about during the pandemic, right? That there's a greater awareness of the many problems in the global north as a result of pandemic issues. But so getting back to thinking about carbon, I think there are these different vantage points it allows, but it does, it's not as if most people around the world could look at a tree and say, well, assess carbon, right? So that's that part about expertise and kind of privileging a way of knowing that's external from how many people have known their forests. But in addition, I think, Elsa, your new work is kind of related to stuff I did a couple decades ago, but in the sense of like how communities understand forests and those relationships. And I think that's something you kind of talked about tangentially, maybe, so that what a lot of like indigenous theorists talk about is this idea of relationality, right? And in Spanish, we often say conviviality, that the idea is not about cover or cover types necessarily, but what particular places reveal about understanding of relationships. And they're not just simply like that idea of natural either, but also people and those histories that one can read in landscapes. So local folks who've been the ones working in their spaces, much as most of us can narrate the landscapes where we are right now, given our personal histories in them, what we've seen and done and experienced. Other people can around the world with their forests. And so it's, rather than like cover types, it is about those histories of people, animal, plant, spirits, other things that are in relationship with humans and with humans are in relationship with, that create some of these ways of knowing forests that are perhaps things scientists have been less attentive to.
If I could ask a question, which is, I think, one of those that we often struggle with, and there was reference to sort of the colonial approaches to science and the importance of decolonizing those spaces. One of the things that I've been working on has been participatory scenario-based planning, working with Emberan Kuna community members in elucidating their visions for the future of their forests. And one of the things that we looked at was how the forest estate would change over the next 50 years. And we had a previous study that had modeled that same landscape in terms of deforestation based on well-known drivers of deforestation, whether it was slope or proximity to roads or you name it. And the results were very divergent between what their vision of future land use was and what the technical forest modeling, computer-based modeling exercises were revealing. And, you know, surprisingly, for the next 10 years, these three territories envision losing more forest than what the computer-based models were suggesting under a business as usual scenario, under their ideal vision of future land use. And, you know, which of those ways of knowing is going to be the one that would actually influence, for example, if they were to go into some a RED project, you know, you got two different techniques of knowledge that are studying the exact same landscape with divergent results. And, you know, because of discriminatory practice against community generated data, you know, my sense is that attention would be paid more to the computer-based models when it comes to decision making than to the community generated data, which is just troubling, right? And I don't know how those two are reconcilable, but Julie, you've been in this space for a long time, and I'd be curious to hear if you have any experiences where traditional community generated data is pitted against, I guess, classically trained scientific Western science, and what have been the outcomes of that, or of any of you, Sarah and Elsa as well. I'd be curious to hear that, because it's one of the issues that we're starting to grapple with.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of examples, but the one you might be most familiar with is, or maybe not directly, but you might be as well, which is, you know, there are many different ways to model. And you can model without ever having stepped foot in a place these days, right? And it's super common in ecology now, right? That you model from your desk wherever you are, someplace halfway around the world. There's also modeling where you spend a lot of time in a place and have data and put it into a model, right? But in Eastern Panama, with the paving of the Pan American Highway that occurred in the kind of early 2000s to being finished in 2009, one of the ways that was justified was with a series of models that said, if you put all the territory, if you get property rights for all the residents before that highway was paved, there would be virtually no deforestation. And what we now know is it's very clear, and it was very clear. Actually, a colleague and I wrote a point by point kind of critique of that back when it was first put out. But what that did, that study actually allowed the justification of that $88 million conservation development project that's centered on the paving of the Pan American Highway. And now what's resulted is, you know, not surprisingly, a lot of timbering, as well as all sorts of other illicit commerce these days. But in addition, I think part of that story was that in spite of their communities being promised that their lands would have legal rights, that step was, as you mentioned in your earlier comments, it was never done. So that folks are still struggling for their land rights. That said, as we know from other places, just because you have rights to your land doesn't mean somebody's not going to come and deforest them without your consent, right? So those are some of the, I think, the conundrums. But people at the time completely doubted that having both their rights and having the highway paved would follow the modeling version, which was that everything would remain forested. They very much understood that, like, when the highway was extended in the 80s, what happened was a huge influx of migrants, cattle ranching, land theft and land speculation. And the Vaughn and Embera and the Kuna I spoke to at the time completely understood that that's what would happen again. And in fact, that version of reality has played out.
May I ask just very quickly before moving on to a slightly different topic? I was curious because the way that we've been discussing, which I think is representative also of the situation that Javier and Julia are both familiar with in Eastern Panama, where I think partially in response to that situation, we're speaking of expert knowledge and local knowledge as though they may come into contact, but as though they're also quite discrete. And I was curious to hear, Sarah, because your work with mangrove forests in quite a different context, there seems to be more of a sense of malleability almost of these different knowledges and ways that expert knowledge becomes vulnerable to the uncertainty of environment. And there are these ongoing exchanges between like local people and engineers. And I'd be curious to hear you reflect more on that. Like to what extent these categories are stable, to what extent they're destabilized by the materiality of the environments in question.
Yeah, I do think that climate adaptation as a kind of governance intervention breaks away from this modernist assumption that there's local expertise and or local knowledge on one hand and scientific expertise or scientific knowledge on the other hand. And in fact, the point of a climate adaptation intervention, and climate adaptation meaning governance or institutional responses to known or even uncertain climate risks, is to suggest that the very categories, as you're pointing to, Perry, are actually unstable about what expertise is to begin with and how to draw the boundaries between those who claim to have it and those who don't claim to have it. So a concrete example, again, engineers, right? They assume they have an expertise around sea defense, but once one has to take into account the actual long multi-generational experience of erosion of land, as well as trying to create scenario or model building for erosion and sea level rise, one begins to understand that their quote expertise of, say, of the integrity of a groin versus a seawall isn't enough in relationship to trying to understand what are mangrove forests doing, for example. So then one would need to bring in that specific context, as I said, forestry officials as well as botanists to try to get a handle on what then can constitute sea defense in light of climate adaptation, the flood risks, sea level rise risks that shape then erosion along the coast. So with that said, I often try to think about expertise, right, as a kind of knowledge claim, as well as identity claim that emerges through practice, as opposed to assuming the identity categories to begin with. But I also do think expertise as a category is still important to claim and not dismiss, in the sense that, you know, I didn't really hear anyone in Guyana say to me, oh, we want to, you know, detonate the seawalls or detonate the dam or get rid of the engineers. You know, they were really, of course, not surprisingly dependent on that very expertise in order to make sense of their everyday claims to livelihoods, as well as collaborations with the expertise that were with the experts who were coming on into their land to manage flooding. So I think why climate change is interesting for thinking about expertise is precisely because it destabilizes both humanist sciences as well as natural scientists' understandings and assumptions about what constitutes that boundary between, say, scientific knowledge and kind of more everyday understandings of what it means to live with these risks. And so that's just to simply say that, you know, engineers are self-reflexive just as much as, you know, botanists are self-reflexive in these contexts of trying to respond to said risks.
Thank you. It's really, really rich, at least for me, to hear the very different experiences that ground the perspectives that we each bring. And I think at this point in the workshop, I'd like to ask one more question to you as a collective, and then we can open up for a more open Q&A with people who are in the audience and open discussion. But I wanted to shift angles slightly and think from a perspective of narrative, because ethnography, modeling, scenario building are each in their own ways of building narratives that then have some effect in the world, whether that is in influencing what a policy will be, whether it is something more abstract. Like, there are many different ways that the narratives that are being created in practices of science and practices of anthropology are then implicated in the world. And I'd be curious to hear each of you reflect on how climate change puts pressure on the narratives that show up in your work, and also how you see the potential of narrative to contribute to shifting what is happening with climate policy and to contribute to imagining life with climate change differently.
I could start thinking actually about oil palm. There's a really interesting set of narratives around that. I think one of the things that I've been struck by is the level of energy and engagement around climate change from younger generations. And there's a real, I think, anxiety around what's to come, but also a real desire to engage and act. I think in part because of that, and in part because of social media and how widespread it is, there's a lot of sharing of information and kind of messages that don't fully engage with the complexity around these issues. And so oil palm is an interesting example because there is this narrative of it's complicated. On the one hand, it's easy to put orangutans next to a cleared forest and talk about the deforestation associated with it and say, stop buying oil palm or ban oil palm products. But then, again, a lot of my work has shown that it's a very, very different narrative in Central Africa, which is, granted, I will say, not where most of the deforestation associated with oil palm expansion is occurring. Most of that deforestation is happening in Indonesia and Malaysia, and it has led to huge amounts of deforestation. There's no doubt about that. But then the question of thinking about oil palm as one of the highest yielding oil crops is also important to consider, because demands for vegetable oil, I just don't think are going to go away anytime soon. And so where we choose to produce that vegetable oil is an important question. And then given that amount of land is another question related to what type of vegetable. If we stop producing palm oil, vegetable oils are highly substitutable, and we can just pick another type of vegetable oil. And if it's lower yielding, that could potentially lead to further expansion and further deforestation. There's lots of potential implications of just banning palm oil that aren't conveyed in the current narrative. And then also when you think about how it influences kind of production in a place where it is actually has a very different narrative, in a place like Cameroon, where it's a culturally important food staple. It's I think one of the things I've struggled with is when people want an easy answer to a complicated thing, and you tried then to convey a more complex narrative, people's eyes start to glaze over a little bit. And so I think it's really, it's something where I think there's a real interest in wanting to understand what each of us can do to engage. But often when we do start to tell these complex stories, people seem to, I think, lose a little bit of interest. And so thinking about the narratives around who the audience is, what the information is being shared, what the purpose of sharing that information is for. And if it is to motivate action, how do we convey complexity and nuance when it's important? And is it always important? I think are things that I've been thinking a lot about.
I will step in very quickly, Perry, just to follow up on Elsa. I mean, I hear and share your pain about how narratives can catalyze behavioral change or not. And I think the way that we currently communicate about climate change, and this goes beyond scientists, I think it's been well documented, does not necessarily translate into behavioral change for most. reading a study that Columbia University had produced where they highlight some of the key tactics for making headway, which include translating scientific data into concrete experience and avoiding the overuse of emotional appeals and head-on addressing when there's scientific and climatic uncertainty among others. And so this whole space of crafting narratives and learning how to communicate them, to shape behavior, to shape thoughts and motivations, and how social influences come into that space is a really tricky space to operate in. It's sort of the psychology of climate change communication. It's really a tricky space to operate in, and a space where I think we as scientists also need to spend a lot more time thinking about in terms of how we convey messages about the work that we do. In terms of the question that you were asking, Perry, in my field, I think one of the emerging narratives is about the role that Indigenous peoples play in sort of this interface of climate change and forests. And like many other marginalized groups around the world, they have to a great extent received the brunt of the impacts of climate change and will likely continue to do so. And Julie, I don't know if you recall, but there was a study done of where would be the hardest hit areas due to climate change in Panama. This was a few years back. And in terms of sea level rise and shifts in precipitation regimes that would affect agriculture or help to accentuate natural disasters. And even though that study didn't overlay indigenous territories that are legally recognized or under claim, it was interesting to see that it overlapped a lot with indigenous territories. This was just by eyeballing that. And so these kinds of revelations, I think, perpetuate narratives of indigenous peoples strictly as victims, and they are victims often of climate change, but it really removes them also from the fact that they're also part of the solution. And so I'm starting to see signals of improvement in that space. We're not anywhere near where we should be, but there are signals. For example, forests featured very prominently in COP26 in Glasgow last year. And noteworthy was the Glasgow's leaders' declaration on forest and land use. And this was signed by over 140 countries that still hold about 90% of remaining forests. And their pledge was to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, as well as continuing to support sustainable development and promoting inclusive and just rural transitions. There was pledges for $19.2 billion in that space, and both the declaration and the pledges included reference and funding about $1.7 billion in support of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and their participation in decision making and in design of climate programs and finance instruments. So it's probably still too little. And whether these commitments will in effect catalyze change at the scale is yet to be determined, but they give a signal of a growing interest, although very late, I would argue. But it's starting to change, I think, a bit the discussion in terms of how important of a role they play in terms of climate change mitigation and stymieing the tide of biodiversity loss, and not just as victims, as they've often been portrayed. So I'd be curious to hear from Julie if you have also perceived sort of a slow swell of more interest in this space in terms of working with marginalized groups such as indigenous peoples, and the changing in the narrative that you hear often from multilateral development agencies and governments and the funder community and others who operate in that space. Do you perceive a change, or is it still status quo as the past?
Yeah, I mean, I do perceive the change. Glasgow is a big part of that, seeing all the money that was being committed to indigenous peoples. At the same time, you don't hear, for example, folks advocating the land back movement, right? That all the land stolen are going to be turned back over to indigenous peoples, right? So it does feel like there's going to be more wealth capture outside of, through the governments, through the NGOs, rather than with those communities themselves. We also don't see it translating in Panama, for example, into finally recognizing land rights again. So a lot of it seems like a perpetuation of rhetoric rather than significant change, but I would love to be surprised on this. So hopefully I will be. But I think in terms of narrative, one of the things that I've really tried to focus on, and something we hear a lot about it is these days, is just, the crisis narrative that is about environmental issues. But I think Travian Shorters talks about this as deficit framing, that we have a lot of deficit framing in the work we do. And I've been trying to work more on asset framing, thinking about what those assets are. So maybe not marginalized people, but maybe more like folks who have cared for their land and waters would be the asset framing version of that. And I think, and even teaching undergrads and graduates who have, are traumatized by the climate crisis, that framing is, I think, really important. So like we have classes where we go see people who are trying to make concrete improvements and what they're doing and how as part of classes. So I think a lot about that and how we change this path that we've been on for so long, particularly in the global north. Trying to get more creative about both the narrative and voice as part of this.
Yeah, Perry, I think this question about narrative for me has made me think about sort of the ways in which people tell different kinds of stories that don't necessarily rely on a linear framework, and that there is a kind of way in which people can tell stories that poke holes or make visible the gaps in the ways in which they understand how their past and their histories have shaped their present and possible futures. So, for example, in Guyana's context, a lot of the ways in which people try to make claims for climate adaptation, as well as facilitated in the everyday, whether it be, again, engineers in their different institutional settings or ordinary citizens, is through this understanding of, well, why do I choose different kinds of past histories of, say, racialized subjugation or racialized solidarities in order to see my claims be understood through the lens of improvements for damming or canal work? And so oftentimes a lot of people understood that it wasn't just this clear kind of, I think as Javier is pointing to, this clear kind of narrative of victimization, right? There was a sense that the histories that people draw on in the present in order to understand a better present and future oftentimes is much more complicated than trying to suss out who's to blame or who's not to blame, but rather trying to think in the present moment about how the futures can be different from the past, but it might not, pan out in a kind of clear, straightforward narrative from path A to B, but rather might have some shortcomings along the way or obstacles along the way. But those obstacles are still part of that narrative of doing adaptation. And so I think it's important then when we think about what constitute narratives about climate change, it's really about how people play with and try to reorient the past as they make claims in the present and for the future.
I think at this point, it would be good to see if anyone has a question that they'd like to pose from the audience. And if not, I can raise further questions, but while we're waiting, coming back a bit more on, as we had been discussing, narrative, and so there's a question of like what narratives we see in the world, but I'm also curious to think about each of our own work in its way as a process of narrativizing, but a process of narrativizing that's also mediated in different ways, mediated through methods, mediated through disciplinary forms. But there are stories that can be told through modeling. There are stories that can be told through direct experience that are very different kinds of stories that are doing something different, that make visible different relationships in different ways. And And something that I notice in the conversation that we're having and conversations that look at relationships between different kinds of knowledge production is that sometimes we don't think as much about what a narrative is for, what it's doing in the world, and that can shift like what we see to be useful in different methodologies, if that makes sense. And so I'd be curious to hear, like, how do you think about audience of the narratives that you're creating in your work? And like concretely, what is that relationship? Maybe asking Jolie first, because your expression.
Yeah, we think a lot about narrative, both myself and with colleagues. I think part of this is because we publish for multiple publics, and that is very, very intentional. For example, Vaughn colleagues have been very concerned that the younger generations of folks don't understand some aspects of their culture, and so we publish. Like our children's book was one where the donor wanted a book, and we wanted to produce something for Vaughn school children, and so we worked on this children's book as a result. So maybe being able to kind of creatively think about audience to meet multiple objectives. And then we did a peer-reviewed journal article about all of the very subtle indigenous themes that you would not catch unless you knew them. Because we thought that was important too, so that it's understood as more than, just 10 pictures, because it's 10 pictures in text, but there are so many very subtle themes in there, from gender to the role of birds in communicating the present and the past, to ideas of multiple temporalities and multiple spatialities. So those are things that we've talked about. But again, when we decide to publish, it is a discussion about even what language or what languages, whether it's something print, whether it's something for like a map or a history for communities or children's book. We've done flyers. We've done COVID pandemic things. So they're all discussed. And then many things are in English, and then other things are in Spanish, and then other things are in Vaughn. So we work really intentionally to decide what to do, how, and for what purpose. So I think that kind of gets to your question. Is there anything else? Did I miss anything in that question?
No, it was just more an invitation for reflection.
The way you phrased your question, Perry, made me think about, at least in anthropology and maybe the more humanistic social sciences, I think climate change as a topic offers an opportunity to really think about the different kinds of conceptual frameworks and analytic frameworks that our different fields have imposed on how we think about different kinds of places in the world. So for example, one canonical framework in anthropology would be area studies. If one were to think about Guyana, coastal Guyana has often been thought about as the Caribbean, interior Guyana as Amazonia, South American studies, maybe even to a certain extent Latin American studies. But, right, if you take seriously sort of the crude empirical reality on the ground of RED+ programs alongside thinking about climate adaptation programs that are funded by specific UN and World Bank projects that are about climate change, one can think about the messiness of that analytical and conceptual framing of area studies and where would Guyana actually belong? And all of a sudden trying to think about, at least for my work, why it is that historically perhaps some places get marginalized in broader narratives about environment, and how it is that they get repositioned and articulated in the current moment about what constitutes climate adaptation and what do those, or climate change, and And what do those places look like, feel like, who lives there? Why is their expertise important? Why is their expertise not important to, say, global conversations about climate? So I think climate change as a topic allows us to rethink in particular ways why we think about some places as marginal and other places not as marginal. And what are the new languages, what are the new metaphors, what are the different narrative frameworks we can use to think about these places and why they may matter or may not matter to us as we talk about addressing climate change. So I, by the end of writing my first book, I still struggled with that but made it apparent that, it's that very struggle of thinking about what is this place, how is it getting defined for different kinds of audiences, whether they be anthropology audiences or policy audiences. And I think I ended up on the side of just saying, Guyana is a complex regional place. And because of that complexity, it helps us try to think about climate change and adaptation interventions in different ways that we might not see in places, say, in New Orleans, that are also Delta regions and understood as particularly part of the global North. So that's where I've sort of been thinking these days around the question of narrative. It's also a question of place.
Sarah, I like that. It's also interesting because, one of the things I found with graduate students is, recognizing, I think, particularly for students who went to large universities, the siloing, the disciplinary siloing that happens. But one of the things that I find really foundational to my studies is why I say Latin Americanist is because you're trained to think about colonialism. You're also trained to think about history. You have to know multiple languages of the region. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about it, because what's been really clear to me with a lot of students is they've lacked those groundings, partly because of disciplinary siloing. So for example, folks who are only trained like in ecology or just history or just, whatever it is, or just anthropology. And so I think that's one of the great things that area studies has done, is thinking multidisciplinary about a place. But I also appreciate what you're trying to say, what you're saying about thinking about climate change. And I think part of the story is about these interconnections, right? That moving out from just local thinking, but again, some disciplines have done it more than others. I used to say that for me, studying anthropology, space was new to anthropology, and time was new to ecology. And now we see that you can't really say that anymore, but it was really obvious when I was in school that those things were true.
I think I can share a little bit from my side. I think, and I referenced this earlier, which is, one of the audiences that we're trying to get to is our scientific peers in terms of the narrative that's been built around community generated data as being of subpar quality than that developed by professionally trained technicians or scientists. And one of the papers we published a couple of years ago on participatory forest biomass monitoring, we tested specifically for various sources of error when doing the estimates of forest carbon stocks, and that included use of different instruments, vantage point from where you take measurements, but one of them was also human error. And we had our colleagues, our indigenous colleagues, do estimates along with professionally trained, Western science trained colleagues. And as you could imagine, there was no significant difference in terms of the quality and the rigor of the data that was taken. And what was interesting is that when we were doing this, Julie, colleagues of ours were coming to me and asking, like, really, there's this still, I think, deep-rooted narrative of the subpar quality of community-generated data that needs to be shifted. And so part of the work that we've been doing is showing that it is an absolute, valid, rigorous, and culturally appropriate way of doing this, because we're doing it with indigenous peoples by their demand according to their needs and aspirations. And so I think that's one space that it'd be very nice to see that story change over time, and that we hope that we can put a dent into that. Others are doing it, but it's still, I feel, fairly prevalent, regretfully, in our own communities of science, particularly in the biophysical sciences.
Can jump just quickly, like bringing this question in really, oh, okay. Just very quickly bringing this question in relation to Elsa, your work specifically, I would be really curious to hear your reflection on what understandings become possible to narrate through the use of satellites and through remote sensing that we cannot access on the ground. Like, what are the different possibilities that opens up that can then be brought into these conversations, because you have such a depth of engagement there that none of the rest of us do? And then we'll move to Jennifer's question.
I mean, I do know Julie has done work with remote sensing before, so I wouldn't say I'm the only one here who has done that. But and actually, I think I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunities in the area of remote sensing. I'm biased. It's one of my areas of expertise, but I do think it's actually really important to recognize that I don't think you can do it effectively just sitting behind a desk. I mean, as we've heard already, there's a lot of people who do modeling, whether that's kind of process-based models of ecosystems or remote sensing and modeling using remote sensing data. And increasingly, there's a lot you can take that's either already produced or you can fairly quickly produce yourself. For example, above ground biomass estimates or forest cover, forest change, forest type mapping. All these things you can do in theory and come up with an output. But I think, as we've talked about today a little bit, I do think it's actually really critical to connect that with place-based information, which is hard to do when you're working at a global scale. But there's ways to connect what's being done at a global scale with more place-based understandings from a variety. This is where I think kind of thinking about networks of people is really critical, working from different disciplines, working across disciplines, coming from different communities. I think the more we can create spaces to engage and bring in knowledge from place-based and global together to better learn from that across these different knowledge systems too, I think that's really important. So a lot of the remote sensing that I do think is exciting for the kind of work that I do is really focused on two types of sensors, LiDAR and hyperspectral data. LiDAR is a type of active sensor, which means that the energy source is actually from a laser from either an airplane or a satellite, which I can understand can be either frightening or just sound really foreign or something that you wouldn't want near you. And that's actually something, so there's a network called the National Ecological Observatory Network across the United States and Puerto Rico. And there's sites where there is an airplane. It's funded by the National Science Foundation to fly each of these sites every roughly 1 year. And there's a LiDAR sensor and a hyperspectral sensor on there. And I'm part of a group that we're starting, it's very early stages, starting a research coordination network to think about how can we use those types of data, which were really developed with ecological questions in mind, to actually ask more social ecological questions. Is that possible, first of all? And if it is, how can we go about doing that? And critically, I think what we're starting with is recognizing that there's a lot of ancillary data that needs to come in to use those data to address bigger questions. But it's also about understanding those places better and bringing in stakeholders. And a big question there is, there's going to have to be conversations about the fact that there's planes flying over these areas that you live in, or that you recreate in, or that you work in, and what does that mean? What does that look like? So I think actually having those conversations is really critical, given how much remote sensing is kind of all around us, literally these days, and making people kind of empowering people through knowledge a little bit, and then I think there are some tough conversations to have. Google Earth can get to everybody's backyard these days, but how much people know the degree to which that's used and how it's used, I think there's a lot of education to be done on that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of really exciting uses of remote sensing. I think we can push a lot further in terms of how that knowledge is interpreted and actually what we gain from that knowledge by integrating it with other forms of knowledge or other types of information that just isn't remote sensing data. But I also do think that there's some really important conversations to have around remote sensing and where that fits in as a data form or a knowledge form, particularly related to how it's captured and how easy it is to get access to information over areas that we never may step foot. I think there's a lot of really important conversations that need to be had about that sort of thing. I could definitely go into more details about kind of the types of things we're able to measure and sense with remote sensing ecologically, if that's of interest. But I think for the sake of this conversation, there's that other component is a more interesting part of this panel to me. But I can. Does that answer your question, Perry, or do you want me to go in a different direction?
No, that addresses. I would be happy to hear more, but also do want to leave time to respond to this comment from Jennifer. So maybe I'll read that out. As a multidisciplinary, educated but layperson community member, I find that disciplinary expertise silos are increasing. Social media and selective algorithms of online discourse exacerbate this facet. Knowing one's audience is critical for any type of effective communication. How do you recommend that we help each other to move out and about from our respective silos? Obviously, this issue is relevant to most any social interaction. How would you respond to that question? I think that's some of the work that maybe we're trying to do right now, but and Jennifer, I'm assuming that's addressed to everyone, or is it addressed to a specific person? If anyone would like to respond.
I mean, I think the general lesson I always think about is, as researchers to be blunt and strategic about the kinds of questions you're asking, right? To really take seriously that the kind of questions you ask are going to facilitate the kinds of responses you're going to get in the field and the kind of methods you'll probably use in the field. So yes, it's precisely a rhetorical response and a way of framing an argument and framing the kinds of research that you want to do. And also being aware, and this is probably easier in the humanistic social sciences, that your methods change or perhaps have the capacity to change while you're in the field as you recognize the issues that come about in a kind of more empirical way, the kind of data that you get. So, kind of jargon that's just, that I've come across in anthropology from, scholars who try to think about, quote, problem spaces, right? How is the research that you're doing a kind of problem space, not just in terms of the people that you talk to on the ground, and yes, your literal research question, but also how you decide to engage your discipline, right, and other disciplines. So by me asking a question about flooding or climate adaptation in Guyana, using that language allows me, so I'd like to think, knock on wood, so far talk to people outside of anthropology and perhaps even in engineering sciences or history, for example. If I talked about flooding in Guyana, not as climate change, but rather claims to land settlements, I might find myself in different kinds of conversations that I would argue wouldn't be as generative in terms of trying to have specifically across social science and quote, hard science divides. So just being explicit and thinking really critically about the kinds of questions you want to ask.
I'd say too, I agree completely. I think putting effort in to learn the language of, you are I think the question mentioned quote unquote layperson community members, so not necessarily in academia. If you are in academia, I do think there are these disciplinary silos that use so much jargon, and recognizing that both the jargon and the perspectives and the kind of positionality of where somebody's coming from, I think it's worth learning those like terminology and language and trying to engage from the position of people from across different disciplines, because otherwise I think there are barriers to conversation. But that's within academia. I think outside of academia, honestly, I think it's still about kind of being open and learning how to speak across different languages, and doing homework, being willing to actually be able to kind of go beyond what you might have easy access to in terms of information that is presented to you. This comes back to the narrative. There's narratives that have certain framing, and being willing to kind of dig a little bit deeper to understand where that narrative's coming from, and do a little bit of homework to understand in a little bit more depth, because I think that also is pretty critical for kind of going beyond surface level understanding of certain things that can prevent us from really starting to understand things from beyond just the perspective we're familiar with. So I'll put it that way.
And I think it's also really intentionally trying to move beyond those silos and meet and work with other folks. One of the things I didn't mention and meant to is that we've also been working on a zoonotic disease and forest gradients project in Western Panama in the last few years. And it's largely due to the work of our lead PI, who's a veterinarian and an ecologist, but who firmly believes that working with people is required to do this kind of work. So we're a team of veterinarians, ecologists, anthropologists, and parasitologists, working with Panama's Gorgas Memorial Institute, which is like the CDC of Panama. So it's really been a fun project. And I think those spaces, those interdisciplinary spaces, are so generative and interesting that they make the work really enjoyable. So I think that intentional work to expand beyond one's disciplinary boundaries is important.
Just adding on to what Julie just said, my current role is basically about supporting our research community to forge relationships and build bridges with people from other disciplines and from other sectors altogether, and about constituting consortiums in the research for development space that will really take a more integrative and holistic approach to addressing some of the wicked challenges that we face, whether it's climate or agroecological transitions or you name it. And but it's interesting to observe that the challenges of language and translation across the disciplines are still quite prevalent. But it's been very nice to observe our research community being very aware of that and doing what I think Elsa and Julie were referring to in terms of sort of the, in addition to the awareness, is intentionally preparing to understand the different languages and to reconcile them. And it's not easy, but it's great to see that actually is taking place in a lot of spaces, including in academia and beyond.
Thank you very much for these reflections. Thank you for your questions and for thinking together. And I hope everyone on the meeting has a wonderful day. I think we can stop recording then.
And I also wanted to just thank everyone. I've just learned so much from eavesdropping on this conversation. Thank you for all the sort of rich insights that you've pulled here. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to join Perry in saying that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.